without further ado, I'm going to introduce to you, as far as I can tell, the only man in this room who is wearing a pony shirt. Unless I might have missed somebody else, but one of our favorite storytellers in the area. He tells stories to kids, adults, trains all over the place, and he is going to entertain us with a wonderful story tonight. So I'd like you to welcome Charles Johnson.
Thank you, Pat. I am here today to talk to you about a subject in which we are all very much interested, and that is income tax. It's true, because that season's coming up, right? Now, I used to work on the ghost tour many years ago. I was on the ghost tour down in Old Town. And you can ask me about that sometime after this. I got a lot of good stories to tell. But one day we were selling tickets, which is what we do before the tour, and a guy comes up and he buys some tickets and he asks for a receipt. Well, we didn't normally give receipts, and so I had to make something up. But before I gave him a receipt, I had to ask, because he wanted this receipt so he could write it off of his taxes. I had to ask him, I said, what do you do that you can write this off of your taxes? And he said he worked in the movies, that he was a gaffer, which is apparently an electrician who works on a movie set. I thought, that's very interesting. And I went home that night and I wrote down in my dream book, I want a job where I can write off cool stuff, like ghost tours and things like that. Now, I took the job as a ghost tour, not because of the elaborate pay scale or anything like that. I took the job on the ghost tour specifically as a class, because it gave me an opportunity to tell stories to a captive audience 4 times a week, which was very handy when you're just starting out in this career. And I'm all the time taking classes and things like that, trying to work on my craft, so to speak, and that sort of thing. And a couple of years ago, I was going through the rec center. I live here in Escondido. I got the rec center guide, like you guys all do, and they were teaching a class that I've been thinking for years I should take this class. And the class that they were teaching was fencing. Now, when I was a little boy, everybody wanted to be a fireman or a stockbroker or something like that. And I wanted to be a swashbuckling hero. That was my career choice. And so, now that I was an adult, I figured it was time I started working on that. And I thought I should learn to fight with a sword. And so, but before I signed up for the fencing class, I decided that I really didn't know anything about it. And so I went to the font of all knowledge, and I Googled it, and I found a couple of videos, and so I watched. And I was horribly disappointed. First of all, I assumed that fencing was 2 guys in puffy shirts who stood toe-to-toe and, chained their swords back and forth and threw one-liners back and forth at each other while they were fighting. But in actuality, fencing is 2 guys with wires trying to be the first one to whip the other one. Bouts last about 4 seconds, and nobody's buckle gets swashed. I was disappointed. But I still thought I should learn to sword fight. So I started looking for classes. I started scouring the internet looking for classes. And I found a class up in Burbank that was being taught by a man named Nick Gillard. Now you probably don't recognize that name, but Nick Gillard was the stunt coordinator for the 3 Star Wars prequels. And the class he was teaching was lightsaber fighting. This is a shinai. It's the sword of a kendoka, which is a practitioner of kendo, just essentially Japanese samurai sword fencing. And it's the sword that you buy when you're taking lightsaber classes. Now we went up to Burbank, and there was a bunch of us that came it was taught at a fencing studio, and we all lined up, and Nick came out to introduce himself, and there was a bunch of guys there, it was a bunch of guys, with t-shirts that said things like, my parents went to Tatooine, and all they bought me was this lousy t-shirt. And Nick says, so are you guys all fans? And I said, I'm not really a Star Wars guy. I'm a professional storyteller, and I thought maybe I could use this in my work. And his face lit up. And he says, I write all of my sword fights like stories. They all have a beginning, a middle, and an end. The combatants all have their own motivations, and I write it into their style of fighting, so that good guys strike at non-vital zones, and bad guys cut at the heads and the hearts and things like that. He says, I write all my fights like stories. And I said, I have come to the right place. And so we paired up, and what we did is we were to learn the first 20 moves from the final duel between Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker in Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. I have never seen the movie. But I took the role of Obi-Wan Kenobi, and my partner was Anakin Skywalker. And now we learned 20 moves in the course of 2 hours. Apparently, when this duel was fought, it took 20 minutes and covered a quarter of a mile of soundstage when it was played, when they fought at real speed. The first thing you noticed was the sound. When they teach a sword fighting duel for the movies, it's actually written 4 moves at a time. So if you know anything about music, it goes in a 4/4 beat. So it's got this rhythm that's like music. And when these two things hit, they sound like lightsabers clashing together. I told my partner, I said, 15-year-old me is so jazzed right now. Now, we learned, it took us two hours to learn the 20 moves, and we did it, when we fought it, it was like 30 seconds long, and I was exhausted. And I figured, I'm never going to use this literally in my work. But the fact is that I learned to tell a story through physicality, and I learned to display motivations through physical action. And I thought, this is the kind of thing that is going to color my work for the rest of my life. And I did write it off on my taxes. And so, last year, we took this trip to Japan. We went to Osaka, which, if you're a foodie, you go to Osaka. You don't go to Tokyo. It's like when they tell people they're coming to America, they're like, if you're a foodie, go to Chicago. Don't waste your time in New York. So we went to Osaka. We were having a good time, and we ate a lot of sushi and drank a lot of sake and that sort of thing. And I wanted to go on the tour of the old Imperial Palace. The one in Kyoto, not the one in Tokyo, like the one that was built in the 12th century, and like they moved the emperor out in the 1800s and put him in the big one in Tokyo, the modern place. And I wanted to go to the old one in Kyoto. And so we went, we took the train, they stuff everybody in the train. We went to Kyoto, we went to the old Imperial Palace, and we went on the tour. We got the headphones with the English tour, and we wandered through the palace, and at the end, there's what they call the trophy room, which is this huge room. It's probably 100 feet long and 30 feet wide. It's probably as wide as this room is long. And it's forever tall. And one wall, on the eastern side, is, those sliding Japanese doors that are like the squares that are covered in rice paper? That's what this one wall is, 100 feet long and forever tall. And so it's not rice paper, which I imagine it was rice paper probably up until 1940, and now it's white glass. And so this wall is just all light. And on this other wall, there's suits of armor and swords up on the wall. And I remember they had a stuffed giraffe, like a real giraffe, and he was mounted in a pose like he was running. And behind him, he had a lion that was chasing after him. It was kind of cool. And we're wandering through, and I'm listening to the tour. Yeah, and it's what they had. And it's the Japanese emperor. And so I'm listening to the tour, and we get to the back, and there's a little alcove, and inside this alcove is the weirdest thing I've ever seen. It was obviously organic, some sort of animal, and it was kind of the size and shape of the back of an old Volkswagen. And it was black, and it was shiny in some spots and dull in another. And obviously there was pieces falling off it, and there was dust on the floor. And it wasn't in the tour, so I didn't know what it was. And there was a plaque next to it, but it was written in Japanese. But the date was, it was in Arabic numerals, the same numerals we use, and it was 1542. So I asked the docent, I said, what is this thing? And he spoke English, and he said, that is the head of the goblin spider of Nagano. I said, elucidate me, please. And he said, in the 16th century, the mountain village of Nagano, where they had the Olympics a couple years ago, the mountain village of Nagano was plagued by a hideous goblin spider. It was the size of a house, and it had legs made of iron, and at night it would walk into the village, and its legs would clang against the ground, and sparks would fly up whenever it touched a rock. And it would come into the village with its 8 glowing red eyes, looking for anybody foolish enough to be out after dark, and it would gobble him up. But worse than that, it came in with this goblin army, like hideous creatures, man-shaped beasts with green scales and a single horn over its single eye, or like ghost-like creatures with really long arms and black claws and black teeth. And these things would, there was nobody out for the goblin spider to eat, they would reach into people's windows and drag them out of their beds and throw them into the maw of this hideous beast. Yeah, it was terrible. so the people of Nagano, they said to the emperor, Emperor, you've got to send somebody to help us. So he picked his greatest samurai, Reiko, and his faithful companion, Suna. And Reiko and Suna, they had fought goblins and beasts and dragons all over Japan, so they thought a goblin spider, no big deal. And they sent them up to Nagano. And the people of Nagano told them that the monster lived in this old monastery out in the middle of the woods. And so the 2 samurais crept out into the woods where there was this old monastery with a gate that was kind of hanging on its hinge. And they opened it up and walked inside. And then they were in a courtyard, surrounded by the building. But they didn't see any goblin spider or any hideous goblin army. But the clouds started to turn dark, and the rain started to come down upon them as they stood there in the middle of the courtyard. And then when the lightning struck, they could see in the shadows hideous shapes, terrible creatures, things with no heads, but they had eyes in their palms and a great mouth in the middle of their stomach, or things that looked like snakes that walked out on 2 legs and had the face of a man, or hideous like monkey-type creatures with red hair. Oh, it was terrible. And these goblins started to come out of all the dark corners of the monastery. And Reiko and Suna, they pulled out their swords and they stood back to back, ready to battle this army. And then when the lightning struck again, the army threw themselves upon Reiko and Suna. They slashed at the goblins and fought them back all through the night as the rain poured upon them, hour after hour. Every time they sliced down one demon, another one would appear. Oh, it was terrible. After hours and hours of fighting, Suna was exhausted, and he said, Master, I do not think we will last much longer. And Reiko said, never fear, Suna, for I believe salvation is soon be with us. And with that, and you could hear in the distance the cock crowed, and when it did, the goblin army froze. And the sun came out, and the clouds parted, and the goblins shrieked at the sunlight, and they recoiled back into the darkness. And there Reiko and Suna stood in the middle of the courtyard. And Suna said, Master, we have seen every manner of goblin tonight, but we have not seen the goblin spider. And Reiko said, Suna, I believe it is closer than you think. And he knelt down, and with the butt of his sword, he thumped it on the flagstones, and beneath they could hear a great hollow space. So they reached around the flagstones, they picked it up with their arms, and they flung it to one side, and beneath the monastery they could see a huge cavern. And in the gloom was a giant spider, the size of a house, with 8 legs made of iron and 8 glowing red eyes. And it looked up at them, and it hissed. That's what it talked. It said, if you leave this place, I will let you live. But should you choose to stay, you will face your doom. And Reiko said, but the fact that you're giving us a choice means you're more scared of us than we are of you. And he looked at Suna, and they drew their swords and leapt into the hole. The 2 warriors landed flat-footed in the middle of the cavern, and as they stood in the pool of sunlight, that huge spider started running straight towards them, its feet clang, clang, clanging on the ground, sparks flying up from the rocks, and as it ran in, with its 2 front legs, it went shing, shing down in front of them. And Reiko and Suna slashed at the iron legs with their swords, sending sparks flying into the air, and the spider shrieked and recoiled into the darkness. And Suna said, Master, I do not believe that our swords did that creature any harm. And Reiko said, no, they did not. but the sunlight reflecting from our arms and armor certainly harmed it, and that's why it could not hurt us. But again and again, hour after hour, that spider would rush in and try and grab the two warriors with its maw, or try and stab it with its arms, and again, it was turned back by the sparkling sunlight from their arms and armor. But of course, throughout the course of the day, the sun tracked across the sky, and as it did, the pool of light in which they stood moved further and further across the cavern, until finally their backs were against the wall. And the sun was traveling up their bodies, and they could see that goblin spider waiting, biding its time in the darkness. And Suna said, "Master, I'm afraid the sun will leave us soon." And Reiko said, "Well then, we shall just have to kill this creature in the dark." And with that, that's what he said, I swear. And with that, the last little bit of sunlight left from the tops of their helmets, and when it did, the spider let out a shriek, and it started to come forward faster than ever, ready to deal death on the two strong warriors. And as it came closer, Suna reached with his sword as high as he possibly could, and with the tip of it, he grabbed the last fleeting bit of sunlight and shined it down into the eyes of the giant creature. And it shrieked and reared up on its back legs, and when it did, Reiko rushed in, and with his katana, he brought it right up into the belly of the beast and killed it. That's how it happened. And the people of Nagano, they relieved this monster of its head, and they gave it to the emperor in Kyoto as a gift, where it sat that day that I went to see it. And because that docent was so kind enough to share that story with me, I was able to write off that whole trip. Thus saving me hundreds